All of Christianity, the reason we're here today, did not start with the Bible. It started with an event. There was a guy named Jesus from a poor village claiming to be God. And that itself wouldn't have really made history books because there were a lot of cult leaders, and he begins to gain this following, and he's doing these teachings, but the teachings, and this is one of the things that set them apart, not why we study them still, but one of the things that set them apart was the content of his teachings were unlike anything else. They were completely countercultural. He talked about how all people had worth and all people had value, and it didn't just matter how good you were doing religiously, and it didn't just matter what type of status you were born into, but that all people were made in the image of God. And then he talked about living out that life meant that you actually care for one another and you love people even more than yourself, and that's how you play out your relationship with God. So again, some pretty countercultural stuff that he was teaching, but that's still not why he made our history books, because that wasn't that uncommon. People were saying some countercultural stuff, that's fine. What began to happen was, as he's gaining this following, he would predict his death, and then he would die. And still, the reason he would die is because the religious leaders thought, if we're gonna end this cult, let's kill the leader, and that should take care of it. And still, he should have never made the history books. But then all the people who were following him, they ran and they hid, and they were scared of persecution, and they were scared of being next, and so there were no more Christ followers after he died. Because how could God die? And if he was God, this must not have been it. But then something happened that changed history. Something happened where all of the hundreds of eyewitnesses, many who had given up and claimed they saw him die so he could not have been God, began to run back into the streets. And in the face of possible persecution, told those who killed Jesus, no, you were wrong. In fact, he is who he said he is. We saw him die, and then we saw him again. And they were so convinced that hundreds of people would begin to give their lives and say, everything he said had to have been true. Everything he said had to have been validated because we saw him again. And they were so convinced that a movement began to break out. And a movement that would change culture. It was an event that sparked a movement. And as people began to spread this story and consider what Jesus' words meant for them, they would meet together and they would develop these churches and gatherings to talk about the ways of Jesus and what this would look like and verify stories from one another. And all of a sudden, all of culture, all of history began to change. The thing that the religious leaders were trying to put an end to began to grow like ever before. And a movement was taking place that was absolutely changing culture and changing the world. So then, people wanted to document it. So it was an event that sparked a movement that was then documented.